Over the last several days, a sublime paradox that was introduced some long while ago was reintroduced and resurfaced for us. And that sublime paradox is, how do we reconcile the state of becoming and having arrived? Realizing that we cannot solve this paradox unless and until we've experienced in ourselves the meeting of stillness and movement. So this sublime paradox, having arisen again, is there for us to reconcile. State of becoming and having arrived. So let's put several ingredients in the pot and see what they stir up for us. The first is that story about the king, who was a very, very good king. He served his people very, very well, and he was of a spiritual bent, and so he did have a spiritual mentor and guru who he visited from time to time. But he'd reached a state in his reign where he was totally and completely worn out and weighed down by the responsibilities of his kingdom. Day after day, ensuring that the coffers were filled in case there was a famine, to ensure that his soldiers were well trained to keep his boundaries safe, listening and solving the grievances of the many people of his populace who came day after day to see him. So after many, many sleepless nights, worn down completely by his responsibilities, he went off to his spiritual guru and said to him, "I cannot do it any longer. I am so worn out. I cannot continue to reign over this kingdom." "Oh," said his spiritual guru, "well, why don't you abdicate and hand over the reins of your kingdom to your son?" And the king said, "But my son is only 8 years old. He's not old enough to take over the kingdom for some long while yet." So the spiritual guru pondered on this for a moment or two, and he said, "Well, let me take over your kingdom." Well, in that instant, it seemed like the burdens that the king had carried fell away from his shoulders, and he let out a deep sigh of relief, and he said, "Really, really, will you take over my kingdom? When will you come? When will you come to take over the reins?" And the spiritual guru said, "Oh, I won't come to the capital. You'll have to choose an advisor or someone worthy to take over and run the day-to-day affairs. You know, I'm quite happy where I am here in my little hut in the mountains." No. But the king said, but there is no one. There is no one who would be able to take care of the kingdom. And well, said the spiritual guru, "Well, perhaps you could do so. You have all the qualifications. You've had lots of experience at this. Why don't you just run the place for me? And I'll come from time to time. If you've got any problems to deal with, just to contact me, and I'll solve them for you." Well, the king was totally relieved and happy, and he went back to his kingdom. And he didn't bother to get in touch with his spiritual guru at all, because he handled all the affairs of state and everything that went on quite capably, thank you very much. So one day the spiritual guru went off to visit the king in his palace to ask him how his kingdom was going. His own kingdom, the spiritual guru, that is, saying, "Well, how are you running my kingdom?" And the king said, "Oh, it's just wonderful. I'm so happy. Things are running very, very smoothly. The coffers are full, and I'm dealing with all the problems of the people, and I'm feeling light. I have time for myself and my family. The whole place is running very, very well." No, of course, the spiritual guru said, "Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Just keep me informed, and if there's anything at all that you need any advice about, I'm always there in my hut in the mountains. But, remember, it's my kingdom." And then the second story was told whilst we were away, and cutting it down very short, it's about an ugly man. And his name was Itaitoe. He was the ugliest man you ever did see. Unimaginable. He had these dark eyebrows that jutted out of eyes that were too close together, black and piercing and hooded, a nose that meandered like an ancient river, lips that protruded over bent and teeth, and jowls that hung down to his shoulders, ears that jutted out at the side, and hair sticking out of his nose, and arms that hung down below his knees, beside a body that was like a gnarled old tree, bent and so forth. He was really the ugliest of specimens. But despite his looks, he was loved and revered by all who knew him. And he lived in a small cottage on the edge of a forest, in a far-off place. But his fame, you might call it, reached the capital city, where the Duke of Luk reigned. Now the Duke of Luk was another monarch who was weighed down by the duties of his kingdom. Again, sleepless nights and anxiety and so forth and so on. But when he heard of this strange fellow who lived in a village far away, in his desperation, he decided that he would go and seek his counsel. So he travelled on his most speedy stallion, and he rode towards the village in which Itaitoe lived. And as he was approaching the village, he came to the village well, around which there were a number of maidens drawing water. And he asked them where he might find Itaitoe. And to his very great surprise, these maidens, their faces lit up, and they spoke of Itaitoe as though he were some handsome suitor, like a Krishna, who danced with them all in the Brindavan gardens. Their voices softened as they spoke of him. How kind, how gentle he was, always fulfilling people's needs, giving advice when it was needed. So the Duke of Luk got back on his stallion again and rode towards Itaitoe's abode. And when he came to the door of this simple cottage, and the door was answered, the Duke of Luk almost recoiled when he saw the sight of this gnarled and ugly specimen of humanity. But when Itaitoe smiled at him in greeting, the sunshine, the love that shone from this ugly being enveloped the Duke of Luk So he immediately felt as though a wave of sunshine and spring rain had descended on him. Itaitoe invited him in, and they sat by the fire over a bowl of soup, and when the Duke of Luk went into Itaitoe's cottage, he was greatly surprised to see it as a gracious abode, everything in place, even the tools of Itaitoe's trade, because he was a wood chopper and carver, were neatly in place around the walls. The table was set with a cloth and flowers. It was a gracious, gracious and harmonious abode. As they sat by the fire, the Duke of Luk relieved himself of the burden that he had carried of taking care of his large domain, and Itaitoe listened attentively, not speaking, but nodding from time to time, indicating that he was listening attentively and taking in what the Duke was saying to him. Itaitoe invited the Duke to stay with him for a few days, and took him out in the forest, introducing him to the animals, the plants, the herbs, the trees that he knew so well. And not only did the Duke of Luk's burden fall from him, but he began to feel lighter and lighter and lighter. But after a few days it was necessary for him to go back, and he invited Itaitoe to accompany him. Itaitoe refused. No, 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 no. But the Duke of Luk absolutely begged him, please, please come. So Itaitoe said, well, when the winter comes and snow is on the ground and I can no longer go into the forest, I will come. And so the Duke of Luk rode off back to his kingdom and awaited the presence of this ugly man who had become his closest and dearest friend and advisor. The winter came, and so Itaitoe presented himself at the palace door. He was to be sent away by the servants. They'd never seen such an ugly man, straw sandals and ragged cloak. But when they came in to the Duke of Luk and told them that they had sent away this apparition, he ran out and brought Itaitoe back. He settled Itaitoe in a palatial chamber, satin sheets. Everyone was repelled by his presence at first, but even the maidservants came to smile and greet him, speaking to him and seeking his counsel after a few days in his presence. But the Duke of Luk could hear Itaitoe pacing in his palatial chamber at night, recognizing that he was not at all happy in his surroundings. Itaitoe gave advice to the Duke of Luk, as he did, and the Duke of Luk found harmony coming to his kingdom. And during one night, the Duke of Luk had a wonderful idea. And the next day he called Itaitoe to him and said, "I have decided to hand my kingdom over to you." It was the first time the Duke of Luk had seen any semblance of anger come over the visage of Itaitoe. His bushy eyebrows came together. There was a great scowl on his face. His nose quivered and his mouth drew down. He took his leave of the Duke of Luk and went back to his chamber, leaving the Duke of Luk bewildered. That night the Duke of Luk heard the pacing steps of Itaitoe back and forth in his chamber. But the next morning, when he went to knock on the door, and it was opened, Itaitoe had gone. There was no sign of him to be found. He sent out messengers to the village, but he had not returned. Itaitoe was not heard of nor seen again. What's the deep meaning of these two stories as we put them in our pot? What do they bring up for us now? And what have they to do with the paradox? The paradox of how does becoming and knowing that we've arrived come together seamlessly, like time and timelessness, stillness and movement. What arises for you out of these two stories? From our experience, just like the reconciliation cannot be brought about by the mind's machinations, can only come from experience. If we can answer where stillness and movement meet in us, we have a possibility of reconciling and solving the paradox of becoming and arriving. Thank you.